The sun rose slowly over Clearwater Lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine trees that lined the shore. Birds chirped softly in the distance, their songs blending harmoniously with the gentle lapping of water against the rocks. It was the kind of morning that made Daniel Harper feel alive. Daniel sat quietly in his small wooden boat, drifting lazily near the center of the lake. His fishing rod rested between his hands, its line disappearing into the clear blue water below. He wasn't expecting to catch anything big today, maybe just a few trout. But that didn't matter. For Daniel, fishing wasn't about the prize at the end of the line. It was about the stillness, the escape from the noise of everyday life. At 32 years old, Daniel had learned to appreciate simplicity. He lived alone in a modest apartment in town, working odd jobs to get by. Most people would call his lifestyle unremarkable, but Daniel liked it that way. There were no grand ambitions driving him, no need to prove himself to anyone. All he wanted was peace, and Clearwater Lake gave him exactly that. As he waited patiently for a bite, the tranquility of the moment was shattered. A loud roar echoed across the water, growing louder with each passing second. Daniel turned his head to see a sleek white motorboat speeding toward him. Its wake created waves that rocked his tiny vessel, sending droplets of water splashing onto his shirt. He frowned, gripping the sides of the boat to steady himself. "What's the hurry?" he muttered under his breath, watching as the motorboat circled dangerously close to him. Behind the wheel was a woman, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail. She wore sunglasses that hid her eyes, but her expression left no room for doubt. She looked irritated. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she cut the engine and let the boat drift closer to Daniel's. "You," she called out sharply, pointing a finger at him. "What do you think you're doing here?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard by her tone. "I'm fishing," he replied simply, gesturing to his rod. "Why? Is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem," she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "This is private property. You can't be here." "Private property?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, confused. He'd been coming to Clearwater Lake for years, long before this woman ever showed up. No one had ever told him he couldn't fish here. "I don't think so," he said cautiously. "I've been fishing here for as long as I can remember. Nobody said anything about it being private." "Well, they should have," she retorted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because it is. This part of the lake belongs to my resort. If you don't leave right now, I'll call the authorities." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Daniel studied her face, trying to gauge whether she was serious. She certainly seemed like she meant business. Her confident stance and sharp tone suggested she wasn't someone used to being challenged. "And who are you exactly?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice calm despite the rising tension. "Grace Miller," she answered briskly. "Owner of Clearwater Resort. And unless you want trouble, you'll pack up your things and go." Clearwater Resort. Daniel vaguely remembered hearing about it when it opened a few years ago. It was a fancy place, catering to tourists looking for luxury vacations. He hadn't paid much attention to it since it didn't affect his routine. Until now, apparently. "I'm not causing any harm," Daniel said firmly. "I'm just fishing. I haven't done anything wrong." "That's not for you to decide," Grace shot back. "The law says otherwise. Now, are you leaving or do I need to make a phone call?" Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but something about her attitude rubbed him the wrong way. Who did she think she was, swooping in and claiming ownership of the lake? Still, arguing with her wouldn't solve anything. "Not here, not now." "Fine," he said finally, reeling in his fishing line. "I'll leave, but this isn't over." Grace smirked, clearly satisfied with herself. "Good choice. Don't come back." With that, she started the motorboat again and sped off, leaving Daniel alone once more. The water settled back into its usual rhythm, but the peacefulness of the morning was gone. Daniel sighed, shaking his head as he rowed toward the shore. He couldn't shake the feeling that Grace was mistaken or maybe even lying. Clearwater Lake had always been open to everyone, a shared piece of nature that belonged to no single person, or so he thought. As he packed up his gear and headed home, Daniel resolved to find out the truth. Whatever it took, he wasn't going to let Grace push him around without a fight. Little did he know this encounter would set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. Later that day, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what Grace had said. Private property, it didn't make sense. Clearwater Lake had always been a place where locals came to relax, fish, or enjoy picnics by the shore. No one had ever mentioned restrictions before. Was Grace telling the truth, or was she bluffing to keep people away? Determined to find answers, Daniel decided to visit the local courthouse. He wasn't sure where to start, but he figured if anyone knew who owned the lake, it would be there. As he walked through the heavy wooden doors of the building, the smell of old paper and polished wood greeted him. The courthouse was quiet, with only a few people scattered around, flipping through records or speaking softly to clerks. Daniel approached the front desk, where a middle-aged woman with glasses sat, typing on a computer. She glanced up at him with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied. "I'm trying to find out who owns Clearwater Lake. Do you have any records of that?" The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Clearwater Lake, you say? Let me see what I can find." She turned back to her computer, her fingers tapping quickly on the keyboard. After a moment, she frowned. There's no recent record of ownership here, but we do have some older documents stored in the archives. You might want to check those." She pointed toward a doorway leading to a dimly lit room lined with shelves stacked high with dusty folders and ledgers. Daniel thanked her and stepped inside. The air felt cooler here, carrying the faint scent of age and history. He began searching through the shelves, scanning labels until he found one marked Land Deeds, early 20th century. As he flipped through the pages of an old ledger, something caught his eye. A name jumped out at him: Harper. His heart skipped a beat as he read further. According to the document, Clearwater Lake had been deeded to someone named Robert Harper in 1947 as part of a larger estate sale, and beneath Robert Harper's signature was a note stating that the lake would remain under the Harper family's ownership unless sold or transferred legally. Daniel stared at the page, his mind racing. Robert Harper was his grandfather. That meant the lake belonged to him. He felt a mix of emotions: shock, disbelief, and even a little pride. All these years he'd assumed the lake was public land, accessible to everyone. Now he realized it had been his all along. But how had no one known? How had Grace missed this when she bought her resort? Clutching the deed tightly, Daniel left, the courthouse feeling like a different person. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of responsibility, not just for himself, but for the lake he loved so much. He knew he had to confront Grace again, but he also wanted to handle things carefully. This wasn't just about proving her wrong. It was about protecting something precious. The next morning, Daniel returned to Clearwater Lake, armed with the deed tucked safely in his backpack. He rowed his boat to the same spot where he'd encountered Grace the previous day. Sure enough, it wasn't long before her motorboat appeared on the horizon, buzzing loudly as it approached. Grace slowed down as she spotted him, her expression hardening. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "I told you to stay away." "I'm not trespassing," Daniel said calmly, pulling the deed from his bag. "This is my lake." Grace raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Your lake? What are you talking about?" "This says otherwise," Daniel replied, holding up the document. "My grandfather bought Clearwater Lake back in 1947. Legally, it belongs to me." For a moment, Grace looked stunned. Then her face flushed red with anger. "That's impossible. The resort owns everything around here. We've done our research. This has to be a mistake." "It's not a mistake," Daniel insisted. "You can check the records yourself if you don't believe me. But I'm not leaving, Grace. Not unless you can prove otherwise." Grace clenched her fists, visibly struggling to keep her composure. "Fine," she spat. "We'll see about that." With that, she revved the engine and sped away, leaving Daniel alone once more. Over the next few days, word spread quickly around town about the dispute over Clearwater Lake. Some locals sided with Daniel, praising him for standing up to Grace. and defending the lake's integrity. Others supported Grace, arguing that her resort brought jobs and tourism to the area. Tensions ran high, and Daniel found himself at the center of a growing controversy. Despite the pressure, Daniel remained calm. He visited neighbors and friends, sharing copies of the deed and explaining the situation. Many were shocked to learn the truth about the lake's ownership. Even the mayor reached out to Daniel, expressing concern about potential legal battles. Meanwhile, Grace wasn't backing down either. She hired a lawyer to investigate the matter, determined to prove that Daniel's claim was invalid. Every time they crossed paths, their arguments grew more heated. Grace accused Daniel of greed, while Daniel accused her of arrogance. Neither side seemed willing to budge. One evening, as Daniel sat on his porch reflecting on the chaos, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an old friend, Rachel, who happened to work at the resort. "Hey, Daniel," the message read. "Can we talk? Grace isn't doing well. She's really stressed about this whole thing." Daniel hesitated. He hadn't expected sympathy from anyone connected to Grace, but curiosity got the better of him. They agreed to meet at a small cafe on the edge of town. When Rachel arrived, she looked tired but sincere. "Look, I know Grace comes off as tough," she began, stirring sugar into her coffee. "But she's scared. Losing access to the lake could ruin the resort. It's her father's legacy, you know? She feels like she's failing him." Daniel listened quietly, surprised by Rachel's honesty. He hadn't considered the emotional weight Grace carried. For the first time, he saw her not just as an opponent, but as someone fighting to protect her dreams. "Thanks for telling me," Daniel said finally. "I'll think about it." Back home, Daniel spent hours weighing his options. He didn't want to destroy Grace's business or cause unnecessary harm. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the fact that the lake was rightfully his. Maybe there was a way to resolve things without going to war. An idea began to form in his mind, a compromise. What if he allowed Grace's guests limited access to the lake, provided they followed strict environmental guidelines? It wouldn't be easy, but it could work. The next day, Daniel drafted a proposal and sent it to Grace's lawyer. He held his breath, waiting for her response. Would she listen, or would she dig in her heels even deeper? Only time would tell. When Grace received Daniel's proposal, she didn't know what to think. On one hand, she was furious that he even dared to suggest terms after claiming ownership of the lake. On the other hand, his offer wasn't entirely unreasonable. It included allowing limited access to the lake for her resort guests under strict environmental guidelines, along with a small fee to maintain the area. She hated the idea of owing him anything, but deep down, she knew it might be the only way to save her. Business Grace spent hours pacing in her office, torn between pride and practicality. Her lawyer, Mr. Peterson, had reviewed the proposal and assured her it was legally sound. "It's not perfect," he admitted, "but it could work if you're willing to compromise." Compromise. The word left a bitter taste in Grace's mouth. She had always been a fighter, someone who believed in standing her ground no matter what. But this time the stakes were higher than just winning an argument. If she lost access to the lake completely, the resort would suffer, and so would the people who depended on it for their livelihoods. Finally, she decided to meet with Daniel face to face. They agreed to discuss the details in a neutral setting, a quiet meeting room at the local community center, overlooking the very lake they were fighting over. The day of the meeting arrived, and both Daniel and Grace walked into the room carrying more than just papers. They carried years of assumptions, frustrations, and hidden vulnerabilities. Grace sat stiffly at the table, her posture rigid, while Daniel took a seat across from her, his demeanor calm but cautious. "I got your proposal," Grace began, cutting straight to the point. "Why are you doing this? You could shut me out completely if you wanted to." Daniel met her gaze steadily. "Because I don't want to ruin your business. I've lived here my whole life, Grace. I know how important Clearwater Resort is to the town. All I want is to protect the lake, not destroy what you've built." Grace hesitated, surprised by his honesty. For weeks, she'd painted him as the enemy, someone trying to take everything away from her. But now, sitting across from him, she saw something different. He wasn't greedy or vindictive. He genuinely cared about the lake and the community. "Okay," she said slowly, leaning back in her chair. "Let's talk about your terms." Over the next hour, they went through the proposal line by line. Grace pushed back on some points, insisting on adjustments to ensure her guests wouldn't feel restricted. Daniel listened patiently, making notes and offering compromises where he could. Despite their differences, they found common ground in their shared love for the lake. Both wanted to preserve its beauty and keep it safe from harm. As the conversation continued, the tension between them began to ease. Grace softened slightly, her sharp edges giving way to curiosity. She asked Daniel about his grandfather, the man who had originally purchased the lake. Daniel smiled, sharing stories about how his grandfather taught him to fish and instilled in him a deep respect for nature. He used to say the lake was like a living thing, Daniel explained, something to be cherished, not owned. Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. My dad felt the same way about the resort. He dreamed of creating a place where people could connect with nature without leaving behind a mess. That's why I fight so hard for it. It's all I have left of him." For the first time, Daniel truly understood where Grace was coming from. Her determination wasn't just about profit or power. It was about honoring her father's legacy. In that moment, he realized they weren't so different after all. By the end of the meeting, they had drafted a preliminary agreement. Grace's guests would be allowed to use designated areas of the lake for activities like kayaking and swimming, provided they followed eco-friendly practices. A portion of the fees collected would go toward maintaining the lake's ecosystem, ensuring it remained pristine for future generations. As they shook hands to seal the deal, Grace offered a rare smile. "This doesn't mean we're friends," she joked, though her tone lacked its usual bite. "Of course not," Daniel replied with a chuckle, "but it's a start." Word of their agreement spread quickly through the town. Locals were relieved to see the dispute resolved peacefully, and many praised both Daniel and Grace for putting aside their differences. The mayor even held a small ceremony to celebrate the collaboration, calling it a victory for the entire community. In the weeks that followed, Grace and Daniel began working together more closely. They organized joint efforts to clean up the lake, hosting volunteer days where locals came together to pick up trash and plant native vegetation along the shoreline. Grace introduced new programs at the resort focused on sustainability, encouraging guests to appreciate the natural world around them. Meanwhile, Daniel became a familiar face at the resort, often stopping by to check on things or share tips about fishing spots. Their relationship remained professional, but there were moments when it felt like something more. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace invited Daniel to join her on the dock. They sat side by side in silence, watching the water shimmer under the fading light. "You've changed my mind about a lot of things," Grace admitted softly. "I used to think owning land meant having control, but now I see it's about responsibility." Daniel smiled. "That's what my grandpa always said. The lake doesn't belong to us. It belongs to everyone who loves it." Grace glanced at him, her expression softening. "Thanks for reminding me of that." As the stars began to twinkle above, it was clear that Clearwater Lake had brought two unlikely allies together, not just as neighbors, but as stewards of something far greater than themselves. As weeks turned into months, the agreement between Daniel and Grace began to take shape. Clearwater Lake became a shared space where both their worlds coexisted harmoniously. Guests at Grace's resort were thrilled to have access to the pristine waters, especially since the new eco-friendly initiatives added a unique charm to their experience. Kayaking tours, guided fishing trips, and educational workshops about lake conservation drew visitors from all over the region. Meanwhile, locals like Daniel appreciated that the lake remained protected, free from pollution or overuse. Grace worked tirelessly to ensure her guests respected the rules. She posted signs around the resort reminding everyone to leave no trace, use biodegradable sunscreen, and avoid disturbing wildlife. At first, some visitors grumbled about the restrictions, but Grace stood firm. If we don't protect this place, she told them, it won't be here for anyone to enjoy. Daniel played an active role in helping Grace implement these changes. He often visited the resort to lead fishing workshops, teaching guests sustainable practices passed down from his grandfather. His quiet demeanor and wealthier knowledge earned him respect, not only from Grace, but also from her staff and patrons. Slowly, he became a familiar face at the resort, a trusted ally rather than an outsider. Their collaboration extended beyond work. Grace and Daniel found themselves spending more time together, discussing ideas for improving the lake's ecosystem, or brainstorming ways to attract environmentally conscious tourists. These conversations revealed layers of each other they hadn't seen before. Grace learned that beneath Daniel's calm exterior lay a sharp mind and a deep passion for nature. For his part, Daniel discovered that Grace's toughness masked a caring heart and a fierce determination to honor her father's legacy. One afternoon, as they walked along the shore after inspecting a newly planted section of native vegetation, Grace paused and looked out over the water. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you didn't back down when I tried to kick you off the lake." Daniel chuckled. "Me neither. I wasn't exactly planning to become friends with someone who threatened to call the cops on me." Grace smirked, though her expression softened quickly. "Seriously, though, thank you for being willing to compromise. I know it wasn't easy." "It wasn't," Daniel admitted, "but neither was standing up to you." He grinned, and Grace laughed, a genuine, warm laugh that made her seem less intimidating and more human. They continued walking, sharing stories about their lives. Grace opened up about growing up in the shadow of her father's dreams, how she felt the weight of his expectations every day. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," she confessed, "if I'm living up to what he wanted." "You are," Daniel said firmly. "The resort is amazing, Grace. You've created something special, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes here." His words meant more to her than she expected. For years, she'd doubted herself, always feeling like she had something to prove. Hearing Daniel acknowledge her hard work felt like validation she hadn't realized she needed. In return, Daniel shared bits of his own life, how losing his grandfather left a void he still struggled to fill, and how fishing had been his way of staying connected to him. "He taught me everything I know," Daniel said, gazing out at the lake. "Not just about fishing, but about patience, humility, and letting go when it matters." Grace listened intently, seeing Daniel in a new light. Beneath his unassuming exterior was a man shaped by love and loss, someone who carried his past with grace and purpose. She admired that about him. Their partnership transformed not only their personal dynamic, but also the community's perception of them. Locals who once sided with either Daniel or Grace now saw them as a team working toward a common goal. The mayor even approached them with an idea. Why not host an annual festival celebrating Clearwater Lake? It could bring the town together while raising awareness about environmental conservation. Excited by the proposal, Grace and Daniel threw themselves into organizing the event. They coordinated with local businesses, schools, and volunteers to create activities for all ages. There would be live music, food stalls, art displays inspired by nature, and guided tours of the lake led by Daniel himself. Grace handled logistics using her experience running the resort to ensure everything ran smoothly. On the day of the festival, Clearwater Lake buzzed with energy. Families gathered on the shores, children played games, and musicians performed under colorful tents. During the opening ceremony, the mayor invited Grace and Daniel to speak. Standing side by side in front of the crowd, they addressed the community with gratitude and hope. "This lake belongs to all of us," Daniel said, his voice steady. "It's our responsibility to take care of it, for ourselves, for future generations, and for the countless creatures that call it home." Grace nodded, adding, "We may have started this journey as opponents, but today we stand united. Together we can make sure Clearwater Lake remains a treasure worth protecting." The audience erupted in applause, cheering not just for the festival, but for the unlikely friendship that had blossomed between two people who once couldn't stand each other. That evening, as the festivities wound down, Grace and Daniel returned to the dock where they had shared many conversations. The sky glowed with hues of orange and purple, reflecting off the water in dazzling patterns. They sat quietly, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I never imagined I'd end up here," Grace said after a while. "Working with you, hosting a festival, actually enjoying myself." "Neither did I," Daniel replied with a smile. "But I'm glad we did." Grace glanced at him, her eyes soft. "Me too." For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of crickets, chirping and water lapping against the shore filled the air. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension that had defined their early encounters. As darkness fell and stars began to twinkle above, they both knew one thing for certain. Clearwater Lake had changed them in ways they never anticipated. And perhaps, in its quiet, enduring way, it had brought them closer than either ever thought possible. Months passed and Clearwater Lake thrived under the care of its two stewards, Daniel Harper and Grace Miller. Their partnership had grown stronger with time, evolving from reluctant allies to genuine friends. Together, they ensured that the lake remained a sanctuary for both nature and people, balancing preservation with sustainable use. The annual festival became a beloved tradition, drawing visitors from neighboring towns and strengthening the bond within the community. Grace's resort flourished as well. With Daniel's guidance, she introduced programs that highlighted the beauty and fragility of the lake. Guests learned about local wildlife, participated in cleanup efforts, and even joined Daniel on early morning fishing trips. These experiences not only enriched their stays but also fostered a deeper appreciation for the environment. Grace took pride in knowing her business was making a positive impact, just as her father had hoped. For Daniel, life felt fuller than ever before. The lake, once his solitary refuge, had become a place of connection and collaboration. He cherished the friendships he'd formed through his work with Grace and the community. Though he still valued his quiet moments alone on the water, he found joy in sharing those moments with others too. One crisp autumn evening, Grace invited Daniel to join her on a sunset ride across the lake. "Just us," she said with a smile. "No meetings, no workshops, just a chance to enjoy the view." Daniel agreed, curious about what Grace had in mind. As they rowed out to the middle of the lake, the world seemed to slow down. The air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the water shimmered like glass beneath them. They let the boat drift lazily, watching as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the surface. "It's beautiful," Grace murmured, breaking the silence. "I never really noticed how peaceful it could be out here until now." "That's because you're usually rushing around, trying to keep everything running perfectly," Daniel teased gently. Grace laughed, shaking her head. "True. But maybe I've been missing something important by always being in such a hurry." "Sometimes slowing down is the hardest part," Daniel replied thoughtfully. "But it's worth it when you realize what you've been overlooking." They sat quietly for a while, letting the stillness envelop them. For Grace, this moment felt different, lighter somehow. She glanced at Daniel, noticing the calm confidence in his demeanor. Over the months, she'd come to admire his patience and wisdom, qualities she wished she possessed more of herself. "You've taught me a lot," Grace said finally, her voice soft. "About the lake, about compromise, and about myself." Daniel looked surprised. "Me? Teach you? I think we've both learned from each other." "Maybe," Grace admitted, "but I wouldn't have gotten this far without your help. You didn't have to work with me, not after everything, but you did. And I'll always be grateful for that." Her words hung in the air, sincere and heartfelt. Daniel smiled, touched by her gratitude. "We make a good team, don't we?" "The best," Grace agreed, returning his smile. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, the sky transformed into a canvas of stars. The lake mirrored the celestial display, creating a breathtaking illusion of endless possibility. Sitting there together, Grace and Daniel felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just for what they'd achieved, but for the journey that had brought them here. Over the following months, their friendship continued to deepen. They spent more time together, whether it was working on new projects for the lake or simply enjoying each other's company. Grace often joined Daniel on his fishing trips, marveling at his skill and patience. In return, Daniel accompanied Grace to events at the resort, offering support and encouragement whenever she needed it. The town noticed the change in them too, where once they had been adversaries, they were now inseparable. People joked that Clearwater Lake had worked its magic, turning rivals into partners and perhaps even something more. Neither Grace nor Daniel paid much attention to the speculation. They were content simply being present in each other's lives. One spring morning, as wildflowers began to bloom along the shore, Grace approached Daniel with an idea. "What if we started a scholarship fund?" she suggested excitedly. "Something to help kids from the town pursue careers in environmental science or conservation." Daniel loved the idea immediately. "That's brilliant, Grace. It's exactly the kind of legacy your dad would have wanted. And my grandpa, too." Together they launched the Clearwater Conservation Scholarship, funded by proceeds from the annual festival and donations from resort guests. The program quickly gained traction, inspiring young people to take an active role in protecting the planet. Watching the recipients grow passionate about their studies filled both Grace and Daniel with immense pride. Years later, Clearwater Lake remained a symbol of harmony and resilience. Tourists flocked to its shores, drawn by its natural beauty and the stories of those who cared for it. Locals spoke fondly of the man who owned the lake and the woman who shared it, united by a common purpose. On one particularly memorable evening, Grace and Daniel returned to the dock where it all began. Now older and wiser, they reflected on the path they'd traveled together. The lake was healthier than ever, teeming with life and surrounded by thriving ecosystems. Their partnership had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, and emerged stronger for it. "I never thought I'd end up here," Grace said softly, gazing out at the water, "sharing this place with someone like you." "Neither did I," Daniel replied, his tone warm. "But I can't imagine it any other way." As they stood side by side, hand in hand, they knew they had created something lasting, not just for themselves, but for everyone who called Clearwater Lake home. The lake had given them challenges, lessons, and ultimately, a bond that would endure for the rest of their lives. And so, under the vast starlit sky, they embraced the future with hope and gratitude, forever connected by the waters of Clearwater Lake. Winter arrived at Clearwater Lake, blanketing the area in a soft layer of snow. The once vibrant greens and blues of summer had given way to serene whites and silvers, transforming the landscape into something magical. For Daniel Harper and Grace Miller, this season marked not only a change in weather but also a deepening of their bond. What had started as a contentious relationship had blossomed into a friendship, and now something more. Grace had invited Daniel to spend the evening at her lakeside cabin, a charming little retreat she rarely used due to her busy schedule. Tonight, however, she wanted to escape the hustle of the resort and enjoy some quiet time with him. As they stepped out onto the porch, the crisp air greeted them, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. "I haven't been here in ages," Grace admitted, brushing snow off the railing. "It's nice to slow down for a bit." Daniel smiled, taking in the peaceful surroundings. "This place suits you. Quiet, simple, just like the lake." They spent the early part of the evening inside, sipping hot cocoa by the fireplace. Grace shared stories about growing up in the town, while Daniel talked about his adventures exploring the wilderness as a child. Their laughter echoed through the cozy cabin, filling it with warmth despite the freezing temperatures outside. After a while, Grace suggested they head outside to roast marshmallows over a fire pit she'd set up earlier. "I thought we could Make s'mores, she said with a grin. Unless you're too much of a pro fisherman to handle dessert. Challenge accepted, Daniel replied, grabbing a stick and following her out into the snowy night. The fire crackled merrily as they settled down beside it, the heat chasing away the chill. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, melting instantly when they touched the flames. Grace carefully speared a marshmallow onto her stick and held it over the fire, turning it slowly until it turned golden brown. You're doing it wrong, Daniel teased, watching her technique. Oh, really? Grace raised an eyebrow. And what makes you an expert? Years of practice, he joked, demonstrating his method. Sure enough, his marshmallow came out perfectly toasted, soft and gooey without a hint of burning. Grace rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. Fine, Mr. Expert, teach me your ways. They laughed and joked as they ate their s'mores, the sugary treats melting in their mouths. Between bites, they marveled at how beautiful the lake looked under the moonlight, its icy surface shimmering like glass. The world felt still and perfect, untouched by the chaos of everyday life. As the night wore on, their conversation turned reflective. Grace leaned back in her chair, staring up at the stars. Do you ever think about how far we've come? She asked softly. All the time, Daniel replied. From trying to kick each other off the lake to sitting here making s'mores. It's kinda crazy, isn't it? Grace nodded. I never imagined we'd end up like this. Friends. Partners. She paused, choosing her next words carefully, maybe even more than that. Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Daniel looked at her, his expression thoughtful. He'd felt the same shift in their relationship over the past few months, though neither of them had dared to say it aloud until now. I think we both know where this is going, he said finally, his tone gentle. But I don't want to rush anything. You mean too much to me. Grace's cheeks flushed, though whether from embarrassment or the cold, she wasn't sure. We don't have to figure everything out tonight, she said. But I do know. One thing, I wouldn't trade this for anything. Neither would I, Daniel agreed, reaching over to take her hand. His touch was warm, despite the gloves separating their skin. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. They sat there for a while longer, holding hands and watching the fire burn down to embers. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken promises and shared dreams. Whatever the future held, they knew they would face it together. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and Grace grew closer than ever. They continued working side by side to protect Clearwater Lake, but their partnership extended beyond that. They explored new hobbies. Together, snowshoeing, cooking, stargazing, and discovered countless little things they loved about each other. Grace admired Daniel's calm demeanor and unwavering kindness, while Daniel cherished Grace's determination and passion. Their relationship didn't go unnoticed by the townsfolk, who greeted the news with delight. Many had seen it coming long before Daniel and Grace did, and they were thrilled to see two people so deserving find happiness together. One day, as spring began to thaw the ice on the lake, Grace surprised Daniel with a picnic lunch by the shore. She spread out a blanket beneath a budding tree and unpacked homemade sandwiches, fresh fruit, and lemonade. What's the occasion? Daniel asked, raising an eyebrow playfully. No occasion, Grace replied, handing him a sandwich. Just thought we should celebrate? Celebrate what? Us, she said simply, meeting his gaze. Whatever this is. Whatever it becomes. Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. I can get behind that. They ate their meal surrounded by the sounds of nature waking up after winter's slumber. Birds chirped overhead, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. Grace leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, content in the moment. You know, she said after a while. I used to think owning the resort meant having control. But now I realize the best things in life aren't about control. They're about connection, to people, to places, to moments like this. Daniel nodded, wrapping an arm around her. That's why I love the lake so much. It reminds me that some things are bigger than us, and that's okay. Grace tilted her head to look at him, her eyes shining. Do you think we'll always be this lucky? finding ways to grow together instead of apart? I hope so, Daniel said sincerely. As long as we keep choosing each other, I think we'll be just fine. Grace smiled, leaning in to kiss him. It was a tender moment, full of promise and possibility. As they sat there together, watching the sunlight dance on the water, they knew their journey was far from over, but whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a team, two hearts bound by a shared love for Clearwater Lake and all it represented. And so, under the watchful eye of the changing seasons, Daniel Harper and Grace Miller built a life, rooted in trust, respect, and mutual admiration. Together, they proved that even the most unlikely beginnings could lead to something extraordinary, a story written in the ripples of a timeless lake.